Yeah, thank you very much. It's wonderful to be with you. I've come from Fort Wayne, Indiana, so long way away, but made it here nicely. And have to thank Pastor for the invitation to be here. Maybe he'll regret it later. I guess we'll have to talk to him about that, but hopefully we won't make you regret it or anything. I might just introduce myself a little bit to you. I certainly look forward to getting to know you over the weekend, but as Pastor said, I'm James Bushur. I guess to get the bad stuff out of the way first, I am a Hoosier through and through, it seems. So we got somebody actually is having
Minnesota Gopher here.
Okay, yeah. So I grew up in Indianapolis. Lived in Indiana my whole life. Went to Fort Wayne. I did get out of Indiana 1 year. That's when I did my vicarage at Palo Alto, California, if you know where that is. We had the campus ministry to Stanford University. Loved it out there. It's beautiful. But then came back to Indiana. I served 2 different churches in Indiana. Goodland, Indiana, and Decatur, Indiana, which is just a little south of Fort Wayne. So I was in the parish for 12 years. 2006, I came to the seminary in Fort Wayne and to teach early church history, patristic theology, what we call patristic theology, if you've heard of that. That is the theology of the church fathers. I spent most of my time, my doctoral work was really what I'm going to share a little bit with you today, is the era of martyrdom. Okay? That means the kind of from the year 100 to about the year 313, those 2 centuries that form the very foundations of the Christian church. Okay? So we're going to spend our time in that history, in that era of martyrdom, those 2 centuries here this weekend. And kind of explore that with you, talk about those theological foundations, what it was like for the martyrs, and certainly maybe hopefully what we can learn from them in terms of their theology. Okay? So I've been at the seminary since 2006. Let's see, I did also become the director of the deaconess program in 2011-12, and so I've been there ever since. So it's nice to get out of Fort Wayne. It's nice to be here and be with you. I want to start off just trying to give you a sense of where we're going to go in our 4 sessions. Give you a little sense of what we're going to do tonight and then tomorrow and then Sunday. We have 4 sessions. Tonight, what I really want to try to accomplish is just kind of establish the setting for the martyr church. And maybe especially try to answer 2 big questions. First, why did the conflict happen? Why did Roman cities, city officials in the pagan world, why did they persecute Christians? Okay? What was behind that? What was the form of that conflict? Okay? Then the second big question I hope to get to yet tonight, hopefully we can, is then also what is the strategy of Roman city officials, right? Martyrdom, early martyrdom really happens in pagan cities. City officials in opposition to Christians in their community. So what was their strategy against Christians? Okay. So a good part of that is not only how the Roman government viewed Christians, but also how what it was like to be a Christian in a Gentile pagan city. Okay? So that's what we're going to try to accomplish tonight, give you the setting for martyrdom. Then we want to talk about tomorrow, we want to spend our time really with how did the Christian church respond to martyrdom? How did they respond to the persecution they were suffering? Right, and here we want to get to the theology of the martyrs, and we'll spend some time kind of summarizing what we might call a theology of martyrdom. That is to say, how martyrdom shaped the church's confession of Christ and their theological outlook. But then we also want to get to specific martyrs. in a little bit some highlights from their martyrdom accounts. We have a number of martyr stories that come to us from the early church, and want to share some of that with you as much as we can. I think probably we'll focus especially on 4, if we can at least introduce you to 4. The first one, actually I decided to put the early Christian icon of him up here, is Ignatius of Antioch. Right? Ignatius of Antioch was the bishop or the pastor of the church at Antioch. It was martyred about 110 AD. Okay, so just as you're turning to the 2nd century. Okay, so we actually, from Ignatius, we have a number of letters that he wrote to Christian churches. 8 of those letters. And we still have them. They are a treasure of early Christian thinking. So we'll spend a little time with Ignatius of Antioch, first of all. Then we're going to look at just maybe a little bit at Polycarp. Anybody heard of him? He's a little more famous than a number. But Polycarp, who was the pastor or bishop of the church in Smyrna, which is kind of where Ephesus was, where Paul had done a lot of his work. So we have the earliest, that is the earliest martyrdom account outside the New Testament, is the martyrdom of Polycarp. It happened probably about 156, 160 AD, somewhere in there. Okay? Then we're going to talk about 2 other martyrdom accounts, or at least give you some highlights for them. One is the church in Lyon, or Lyons, which is modern-day France. There was a martyrdom that took place there about 170 AD, toward the end of the 2nd century, a brutal martyrdom. We actually have the letter that was sent out to churches that kind of called for aid for the Christian community in Lyons. If you've heard of St. Irenaeus of Lyons, perhaps one of the very foundational church fathers, he was actually a assistant to the bishop or pastor in Lyon at the time of the martyrdom. He became the bishop then after that, in about 170 AD. So we'll look a little bit at that account. And then the last one we want to maybe hit or just touch on is Perpetua and Felicitas. Anyone hear of them? St. Perpetua and Felicitas. They were 2 female martyrs that were martyred in North Africa right around the year 200, right at the turn of the century, from the 2nd to the 3rd century. And actually, in all of these accounts, especially also the martyrdom of Lyon, as well as Perpetua and Felicitas, women played a significant part in those martyrdom accounts. And we may even have a chance to kind of talk about why that was. So we want to look at tomorrow, spend our time kind of introducing you to some of these early Christian martyrs. How is it that they approached martyrdom? How did they remain faithful? Then the last session on Sunday, my hope is to talk a little bit about today. Okay, and just what can we learn for today? This is part, of course, of the major purpose of maybe our discussion this weekend. Is we are coming into a day that is a little bit more like the era of martyrdom. Okay, it's not the same. Maybe you've heard of Mark Twain's famous saying. He supposedly said this. I don't know if there's anywhere we actually have it recorded. But Mark Twain was supposed to have said that history does not repeat itself, but it does often rhyme with itself. Okay? So we want to actually talk about that our day has a little bit of a resonance with the era of martyrdom. The post-Christian world in which we live has a little bit of resonance with the pre-Christian world, which we're going to be looking at. Right? So that's the plan. That's where we're going. And hopefully we can make our way. We'll see if I can get everything in that we want to get in. So tonight, first of all, what was it like to be a Christian in the 2nd century and in Roman cities, pagan cities? Okay? We do kind of define the era of martyrdom as beginning about 100 or 110. Okay? That doesn't mean there weren't martyrdoms before that. There were. Okay? But the reason we typically use 110 is that's the first time, we're actually going to look at this text, maybe tonight already, but we actually have for the first time a Roman policy about how to deal with Christians. Okay. It's the first official Roman policy that we get from Pliny the Younger, who was the governor of Bithynia, or Asia Minor, where Paul had done his work. Right? So that's the first time Rome actually recognizes Christianity as separate from Judaism. Okay. So that's where we begin the era of martyrdom, about 110. The reason we use 313 AD as the end of the era of martyrdom, there were also martyrdoms after 313, but we usually use 313 because at that point, anybody know what happened in history in 313? 312. What's that?
Edict of Milan.
We have the Edict of Milan, right? We have Constantine, who's converted to Christianity, and he negotiates the Edict of Milan, which is really your first policy of religious freedom that is now declared, right? Which means that everyone in the Roman Empire at that point could worship according to their own conscience. So the Edict of Milan comes along, right? So from 110 to 313, that 200 years is what we mean by the era of martyrdom. So what I want to spend a little time here with first is what was it like for the church coming into the 2nd century at the beginning of that era? What was the transition like for Christians? And maybe the first thing to emphasize here is that Christianity began, as you know from the New Testament, all your New Testament texts are written from within a Jewish context. Christianity begins within Judaism. Okay? Therefore, even from Rome's perspective, Christianity throughout the whole 1st century really is simply seen as a Jewish sect. They didn't really understand Christians as something separate. Okay? And that was actually beneficial to Christians in the 1st century. Because one of the things that the Roman Empire granted Judaism is they allowed Judaism to worship as according to their own traditions. Because Judaism was an ancient religion, Rome simply allowed them to govern their own communities by the law, by the Old Testament law, by the temple, by the sacrifices, by the law of Moses, right? The traditions around the Sabbath. Jesus comes into conflict with that, right? The Gospels are about Jesus operating within this Jewish context and how Christianity begins within that Jewish context. So really throughout the whole 1st century, Christianity is simply enjoys a good deal of the protection that came within Judaism for Christianity, that umbrella. Okay? In fact, St. Paul, I don't know, somebody have a Bible, you might look at Galatians 6 verse 2 or verse 12. You can probably hear in there a little bit in Paul's letter to the Galatians. This is why there were a number of Christians that wanted to continue to identify themselves with Judaism. Right? Paul's opponents, the so-called Judaizers, right, wanted to continue to see Christianity as fundamentally a Jewish religion. Right? So they wanted to continue circumcising, right? If Gentiles converted, we need to circumcise them. Right? And so they wanted to keep circumcision as essential to even being a Christian. Right? Paul resists that. If you look at something like Galatians 6 verse 12, you get a sense there for Paul why these people, why his opponents wanted to continue to circumcise was for what reason? They could avoid martyrdom. Right? They could avoid persecution. Okay. I don't know, do you have Galatians 6:12 to read it? I forget how it kind of puts it.
It is those who want to make a good showing in the flesh who would force you to be circumcised, and only in order that they may not be persecuted for the cross of Christ.
Right. So there you get a little sense, probably already from Paul's perspective in the middle of the first century, that he understands why there is a motive for people, for Christians, wanting to continue to identify themselves, shall we say, as Jews. Right? There was a definite motivation there to be secure, because Rome wouldn't persecute Christians. So what I want to focus on here a little bit is there's at least 3 big factors that leads to Christianity being separated from Judaism. Right? And I think it's worth kind of emphasizing these factors of what it is that led Christianity to become separate from Judaism and seen as separate by the Roman government. Probably the biggest factor is the Jewish rebellion. There's a Jewish rebellion that takes place that leads to the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. Right? The Jews rebelled against Rome. Rome was always worried about Jewish revolts or Jewish rebellions. Right? The Jews were a significant minority within the Roman Empire. They had synagogues in every city of the Roman Empire. So they were a significant threat if they ever rebelled. And they did try to rebel. They tried to revolt and overthrow the Roman government. Ends, of course, in the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. The Jewish community certainly wanted Christians to join them in that rebellion. Anybody know what side Christianity took in that rebellion? They decided to play Switzerland. Stay neutral. Didn't side with Rome. They weren't going to go to battle with the Jewish revolt. In fact, they simply did, it seems, many at least, did what Jesus had told them to do, which was get out of Jerusalem. Right? Jesus had said, this is coming, and when it happens, get out of Jerusalem. Right? And many Christians did. They simply left. Right? Well, being neutral and not taking the side of Judaism, when those Christians came back to Jerusalem, how do you think the Jewish community treated them? Not too well. Right? So it is at that point that you now start to get the Jewish community itself anathematizing Christians. Okay? So you get in the synagogue liturgies, you start getting prayers that anathematize Christians, that basically exile them from the synagogue. They cannot be counted as Jews any longer. So that was a huge factor in terms of kind of why one of the factors that leads to Christianity being seen as different. Probably the second big factor that is happening as you move through the first century is that you've had, since St. Paul at least, well, rooted in Jesus' own ministry, you have a mission to the Gentiles. Okay. Paul sees himself as the missionary to the Gentiles. Matthew 28 had said, what? Go and make disciples of all nations. Right? It was now universal, this covenant of Christ, right? So one of the results of that mission to the Gentiles is that probably as you're reaching the end of the first century, Christian communities are becoming almost, probably reaching kind of the tipping point of becoming a majority Gentile church. Okay. So that's a social reason why Christianity is going to be seen as separate from Judaism. Hard to identify Christianity with Judaism when almost half or more than half of your members in a lot of places are in fact Gentiles. Okay? So those are two big factors. However, I want to point to a third. I think this is important because there is a theological reason for it. And I maybe alluded to it when I mentioned Matthew 28. And that is, to give you a sense of how Judaism understood herself, her own identity. And this is especially true after you come out of the Jewish rebellion. It's estimated that in the Jewish rebellion, when Rome destroyed Jerusalem, probably 500,000 Jews were killed in Jerusalem. That's not to mention many more that were actually sold into slavery. We actually know from the Hebron slave trade that you could buy a Jewish slave for less than it cost to buy a horse. Okay? That means there were a lot of Jewish slaves to be bought. Now, if you're a Jewish rabbi, a leader in the Jewish community, what's your biggest worry if you've just suffered 500,000 dead, many more sold into slavery? What do you think you're most worried about? Are we going to survive as a nation, as a race, as a people? Now, Jewish rabbis put their faith in procreation. That is to say, you now start getting the so-called bachelor laws. Okay? The bachelor laws that are coming out in the synagogues now are saying that Jewish men must marry Jewish women and have Jewish children. If they do not do that, they are accused of breaking the 5th commandment. Why would you be accused of breaking the 5th commandment? Anybody know what the 5th commandment is? Thou shalt not murder, right? Why would you be accused of murder if you remain a bachelor? Right?
You're not, well, the flip side of life, you're not bringing life into the world.
Right. So you're killing the Jewish nation. This is how seriously now the Jewish community is pushing, imposing, putting their faith in procreation. What that means is that the Jewish identity increasingly now becomes genealogical, becomes more of a race. Very difficult for Gentiles to come into it. You might structure Judaism this way. They believed God was primarily creator. He was the giver of the law. He was the ruler of the universe. Okay? Father, Abraham, was their father. Increasingly going to speak of Abraham as father. He's the beginning of the genealogical line. Everybody has to be from Abraham. Right? They're going to put their faith, therefore, in marriage and procreation, right, as the mechanism by which Judaism multiplies. And you might put fourthly there, every child, therefore, must be circumcised, right, to maintain the purity of those who are born. Now, here's the theological factor. Christians of the first century, and I think this undergirds the entire New Testament. This is what the Gospels are about in many ways. Is that Christianity would not define themselves by marriage, procreation, and genealogy. Okay? Genealogy was a huge issue. Maybe here, anybody know how Matthew, certainly within the Jewish context, very Jewish gospel. Anybody know where it begins? What's the beginning of Matthew? It's a genealogy. Okay. Jesus looks like, from the flesh, he's the son of Abraham, the son of David. Right? Begins that way. But does anybody know where Matthew kind of ends? Jesus isn't just son of Abraham, son of David. He's son of God. Christianity understood themselves completely differently. They believed that in Christ a divine genealogy had opened itself up to us, including Gentiles. Okay? That is to say that this is why the virgin birth was so important, right? Who was Jesus' father? Did he have a human father? No. God was his father. Anybody know kind of the heart of John's gospel, which is also a very Jewish gospel, and I think very early. Matthew and John are very Jewish gospels. Anybody know the chief conflict in John's gospel? Jesus calls God what? My Father. And when he calls God my Father, what do the Jews do? Take up stones to stone. But Jesus will continue to call God my Father, my Father. So notice here, God is not just creator anymore, not just lawgiver. For Christians, he is now Father of Jesus Christ. And through Jesus Christ, God wants to be the Father of whom? All of us, through his Son, Jesus Christ. So I mentioned Matthew 28. How did Matthew 28 end? To go and make disciples of all nations. And how do we do that? By baptizing them in the name of the Christians call God Father. That's how Christians pray. Jews did not pray that way. Jews would pray, O God, King of the universe. When the disciples asked Jesus, how should we pray? He says what? Pray, our Father. Okay. Notice the plural our. Who's included in the plural our? Not just all of us who are baptized, but who else? Yeah, Jesus himself. Jesus gives us a place within his own relationship to the Father. Right? So Christians didn't structure themselves racially. Nor did they put their faith finally in procreation. Right? God was Father. Right? He generates his children through his Son, Jesus Christ, and the gift of the Spirit, and they put their faith in baptism and in the resurrection of the dead. Early Christians were Adam. You make Christians by baptism and by the resurrection of the dead. That's where Christians put their hope. They didn't put their hope simply in marriage and procreation. So you're going to have even there a theological reason why Christianity is going to move in a quite different direction. So Christianity by the 2nd century is separated from Judaism, finally recognized by Rome as its own distinct group. So what was it like then, at the beginning of the 2nd century, as these Christians settle in Gentile cities? And here, I need to say a word about the city, and about, because that's where the conflict happens. It first of all happens on the level of city government, okay? City magistrates. At the heart of every Roman city, and maybe here's the primary thing to talk about in the time that we have, big major point we have to kind of get across. In Roman cities, there is no secularism. Everything is spiritual. Cities are religious gatherings. That's how they understand themselves. At the heart of every city is a pagan cult. Artemis of the Ephesians. Right? So the city is where your ground of identity is, and to be in the city is to be a worshiper of its cult. It's like to worship the cult at the heart of your city is your duty as a citizen. It's like paying taxes. This is the god or goddess that is the patron of your city. You rely upon this god or goddess to help you out, to give you good crops, right? To give you fertility, to give you children, to give you success financially, to give you prosperity, help you win in war. Right? So cities are religious gatherings. That's the most ancient definition of a city. You might say the first city is Babel. What did they do at Babel? Why were they gathered together at Babel? To build a tower. It was a religious gathering. Right? The city mediates between its citizens and the gods. This is the importance of the city. The city gives order to that relationship to the gods. And maybe most importantly here, it appeases the gods. It keeps the gods from getting angry, from getting sorrowful, from being disappointed. Okay. Now we could go a lot more into this because this was a huge thing in the ancient world, the place of the passions versus reason. Right? Reason gives stability to the passions. Passions are chaotic. Right? Passions are desires like hunger and thirst. You can't stop them. They move. Well, if the gods get angry, if they start being mad at you, how do you think their anger is going to manifest itself? Storms, hurricanes.
They're going to go against somebody they don't understand.
Right? I mean, you're going to have a lot of problems, right? Your enemies are going to invade and win. They're going to beat you in battle. You know, you're going to get sick. People are going to get sick in the cities. Right? So catastrophes are going to happen. Thus it is the duty, and city magistrates took this very seriously. It is the duty of every citizen in that city to devote themselves to the gods and do their duty, to offer sacrifices, to atone, okay, to make them happy, to show your devotion. One of the other things at the heart of the city, the way they showed devotion to the gods, wasn't just by the temple calls and the sacrifices, but also they were by their festivals. Maybe here, because we're supposed to quit at like 8:15 or so or something. So we got a little time. But another big center of the city were the pagan festivals. You probably still have city festivals. I'm sure Charlotte has its festivals. Fort Wayne, you have a Greek festival, and you have barbecue festival, and you have Johnny Appleseed festival. You have your festivals, right? The ancient world also did. They gathered, they had festivals that were devoted to their god or goddess, right? Whether that was Athena or... And those festivals were a big deal, right? You had the virgins in the temple who would... they would develop the fashion of the garments that would be put upon the statue, right, of that god or goddess. Those garments would become, shall we say, fashion statements that everybody in that city would kind of emulate, right? And dress like an Ephesian. Right? You had food that was prepared for those festivals, right? Restaurants would make food. Artists would make statues and idols that everybody would put on their fireplace, right? On their hearth, on the mantle, so that the house could worship that god or goddess. So it was also the center, in other words, of an economic prosperity. When you had these festivals, who would come? People from all over would come, right? You would also have, of course, one of the big things in these city festivals was athletics, right? In fact, the most ancient, we still have it with us today, athletic competition that's identified with the pagan god or goddess would be what? Yeah, the Olympics. Right? Typically associated still with the city today, right? You have France who does their whole thing. It's a big economic boom for them to have it. In the ancient world, this was taken very seriously, right? Who's coming? They want the emperor to come and participate in the parade, right? And be part of it. Everybody needs to do their part. Everybody needs to participate. This festival to the god or the goddess. Okay. So that's the city in the ancient world. How do you think Christians interacted with that city, right? That is dedicated to that pagan god or goddess? Christians, of course, experienced that city as demonic, as a setting that was forcing idolatry upon them at every turn. Anybody, maybe somebody have the very end of 1 John. I mean, this is a pretty good letter. 1 John was written right at the turn to the 2nd century, probably 90 or so. 80 or 90 AD. Just notice how he kind of ends. I forget the verse, but I just want you to notice kind of how pessimistic he is about the world. So I know a lot of times when we think of sin, we think of the seed of sin as we probably emphasize the flesh, our own flesh the most. And we internalize sin quite a bit. But just notice in John's day, if you go to 1 John and the final chapter, let's see, that would be probably, chapter 5, and look at, maybe start there at verse 18. We know that anyone born of God, notice how John characterizes a Christian. Christian is defined as one who is what? Born of God. Okay. Not born of man or woman. Born of God. We know that anyone born of God does not sin, but he who is born of God keeps him, and the evil one does not touch him. Look at verse 19. We know that we are of God, and the whole world is what? In the power of the evil one. What's his final little statement? Look at the very last verse. Where does he end? Verse 21. What's his final advice? Little children, keep yourself from idols. So this sense of the pagan cults, maybe just to give you a sense of how difficult it was for Christians to avoid these pagan cults. It was just forced upon them. It was a little bit like a fish in a fishbowl. You just cannot get away from it. It is a habitat that forces itself upon you. So, some early Christian fathers will talk about walking down the street of the city and you smell the incense from the cult. The very air you breathe in that city is profane. Is part of the worship of this god or this goddess. You can't avoid it. You can't get out of it any more than you can escape the air. Paul will talk about the demons of the air. Or maybe just to put you in a situation here, you're a Christian slave, and Christianity was probably a lot of its membership were people who were low class, on the fringe of society, slaves. You're a Christian slave in a pagan household. In that pagan household, on the hearth, the center of that house is the fireplace. It's not the TV, right? It's the hearth. At the hearth is where all the food was made. On the mantle of that hearth were all the pagan deities, including your ancestral gods of the household. Everything that was eaten in that house, all the food was implicitly and explicitly dedicated to those gods. Now you're a Christian slave in that household. Are you going to eat? Paul has to deal with one of the fundamental issues he deals with is, do we eat meat that has been sacrificed to idols? Now, you know Paul's advice. Paul's advice basically, finally, is if it's put in front of you, don't ask whether it was dedicated to an idol. Just eat what was put in front of you and give thanks to God. But why does he have to say that? Well, you've got to eat something. Right? You can't avoid it, in other words, in the ancient world. You know, if you're a Christian slave in a household, you're going to be forced into sexual acts. You can be forced into all kinds of sin. Can't avoid it. So, for Christians, this habitat of the city was demonic. We were being forced into idolatry. So, Christians reacted by withdrawing from those festivals, not participating in the cults, not participating in the festivals. And they set up their own church, obviously, their community, as the true city of God. Right? The church's worship was, in some sense, a rival to the pagan cult. Anybody know Augustine, one of his most famous writings? It's called the City of God. So this alternative city within the city. And you can tell it by the way they worship. Right? Their worship was very much a kind of city character. When you entered the worship service, it began with, "Blessed is the kingdom of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit." It was a kingdom you were entering. You were entering into, they called, maybe the most significant thing here is the prayer, Kyrie eleison. We say it over and over. Christian church from the beginning has said this over and over. Kyrie eleison, Lord have mercy. It is the prayer that every time it is prayed in the New Testament, Jesus answers. Every time. Now, the Kyrie eleison was something you might say as a citizen when the parade was happening with the festival. And as the emperor would walk by, the people would all shout out, "Kyrie eleison." That was their statement of acclamation to the emperor as he entered into the city. In fact, he was the only one you were to say Kyrie eleison to. Christians will die because they will not say the Kyrie to anyone other than Jesus. You probably have this in the gospel. Anybody know Jesus, right before he enters Jerusalem, comes across blind Bartimaeus outside Jerusalem? What does blind Bartimaeus start to cry out? Jesus, Son of David, gives him a royal imperial title. Son of David, have mercy on him. What do the people around him tell him to do? You need to shut up. Now why? The Roman soldier around, that's not the best thing to be crying out. To someone who's not seasoned. What does Jesus do? Of course, blind Bartimaeus cries out all the more. And Jesus acts very kingly, right? He stops the procession. He doesn't go to blind Bartimaeus. He says, "Bring him here." And then he asks the very kingly question, "What do you want me to do for you?" I might see, right? And of course, healing him. Then, following blind Bartimaeus, what's the whole crowd saying as Jesus enters Jerusalem? Now they're all following the example of blind Bartimaeus. Hosanna to the Son of David. They're acclaiming him King. Of course, that brings some trouble with it, right? Jesus is going to be crucified for that in some sense. Right? So the sense of Christians now establishing the church as the city of God within the city, a rival to the pagan cults. Now we might just say, we got a couple minutes here. Maybe in that you can see why the conflict is now going to happen. Anybody ever been on a board of a festival? One of these community festivals or something? Well, you probably know how the board works. Right? Every year after the festival's done, you start thinking what? What does the board start to think that runs it?
For the next one.
The next one. But what do they want to know about the last one? How many people showed up? Did we make as much money as last year? Right. And if we didn't, why? When these cities, when you have a Christian church that gets popular enough, has drawn enough citizens of that city into its community, like where Paul had done his work, like Ephesus and places like that. When they have their festivals, they're going to start noticing what about their festivals? People aren't coming. People are not sacrificing to the gods. People are not buying meat sacrificed to God. And then they're going to ask what? They're going to ask, why is this happening? And someone's going to say what? There's those Christians over there, they don't participate. And then you're going to start having maybe a disaster happen. There's a drought and we have no harvest. There's a hurricane that came through that wiped out towns. There's an army that just overran us. And they're going to start to say the gods are angry. Why are the gods angry? Because we're not doing our duty as citizens. And that's because of the Christian. So the Christian community is going to come under suspicion, right? In that kind of fashion. It's going to be not just a social conflict, a cultural conflict, it's all of those, but it's also a deeply religious conflict. Who are we going to worship, right? And the church now setting herself up as a rival to the pagan cults. I think probably that's what will, at least gives you an introduction to the setting of why the conflict's going to happen. I think beginning tomorrow we'll probably start with Pliny's letter to Trajan, and we'll talk about the Roman strategy, all right, against Christians, and then we can talk about how Christians respond, all right? Are there any questions there? I know it's a quick kind of introduction to trying to give you a sense of why the conflict happens, but much more we could do here. We could spend many more hours, but we have to do what we do. But any questions on any of that, or you wanted to bring up? But you have a question?
Yeah.
What is your question?
Why did lion in the picture?
Yes, we'll get to Ignatius of Antioch, but that was the way he was martyred. It's the way he was killed. He was eaten by lions. He was fed to lions. Which some Christians were. Sometimes they gathered Christians or other criminals in the Colosseum, had them face animals like lions. Incidentally, just about that, I saw a picture. It always rubs me the wrong way. I'll just say it, but it always rubs me the wrong way. Sometimes you'll get people that'll probably well-meaning. I don't mean to criticize them really, but they go on tour, go become a tourist in Italy, and they stand in front of the Colosseum and kind of smile and just recognize what you're standing in front of. What Christian blood is on that ground. And I always think it ought to be just a little bit more awe-inspiring in terms of what happened there, rather than just smiling and thinking it's kind of a fun place or something. But yeah.
You brought up Galatians 6.
Yeah. Right.
And do you think that at that point in time when Paul was writing that the concern was more about persecution from the Jews or potentially already from the Romans?
Yeah, probably from his perspective, it's more the Jews, probably at this point. That this is a way of appeasing the Jews. But there's no question that, as you get farther in the first century, one of the ways the Jews could, of course, maybe you have an example of this with Jesus himself. One of the ways the Jews could persecute you is by turning you over to Rome, right, or something like that. So I do think maybe, I think primarily you're right, it's the Jewish persecution. You're going to be kicked out of the synagogue if you're not circumcised, those kind of things.
I mean, I'm sure there was the Jewish awareness that, hey, if you don't draw attention to us, then it's going to come down on our heads.
Yeah, they were well aware that they had been given a special dispensation not to have to worship the pagan gods. Right? So I think Christians too are aware, if we don't circumcise ourselves, if we don't identify ourselves as Jews, we now come under this civic law that demands that we worship the pagan gods, right? That we pay homage, that we pay our taxes, that we stand up for the Pledge of Allegiance or the national anthem. That's what going to the civic cults was. You had to do that as a citizen, right? So I think, yes, I think the Jewish community is well aware that circumcision protected them from that, and certainly Christians, I think, understood that. Right? And yeah.
So I think if you're looking for evidence of it prior to the writing of Ephesus, perhaps.
Yeah.
19, verse 21.
Right.
They're already starting to do that.
Yeah, they're already, the seeds are there, and it's going to happen.